Hello, everyone. Hello. Some things don't change, Jim. Welcome to today's colloquium, the last one of the semester and of the year, and it's going to end with a great bang. Jim Downs will be introducing Jorge, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome Jim Downs, who last year was a fellow here at the Hutchins Center. And as his colloquium last year was about to start, Jim was entertaining me with his wit, which he has in abundance. And I was distracted and did not adequately case the room. And I began my introduction by saying something along the lines of, Jim Downs is the foremost scholar of the American Civil War and its devastating aftermaths. I looked up over the podium, and there, sitting right in front of me, was Drew Faust. You know, the former president of Harvard and the author of The Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War. She was listening intently. I halted and offered a flustered apology, and she basically said, "No, please continue. You are correct." So Jim Downs is a Gilder Lehrman National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Civil War Era Studies and History at Gettysburg College. Incredibly prolific, Jim is the author of Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, and this has been translated into Chinese, French, Japanese, Korean, and Russian. His other books include Sick from Freedom, African American Sickness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation, and 7 edited anthologies. In his newest book, Jim Downs is in conversation about January 6th and the politics of history with the nation's leading historians, including Jill Lepore and Elizabeth Hinton. He's also the editor of Civil War History and has recently been appointed as the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia, which is the oldest library in the nation, founded by Ben Franklin, right? Okay. And the first Library of Congress when the national government was in Philly. Please welcome Jim Downs.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for that that introduction. I'm going to be quick. In October 2013, Jorge Felipe-Gonzalez left Cuba to attend a conference at Michigan State University. When he arrived at the conference, he met legendary historian Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, who had spent the last few decades developing one of the first searchable databases on enslaved Africans to Louisiana in the 18th and 19th century. As an intrepid early pioneer of digital archives, Gwen immediately became impressed with Jorge's capacious knowledge of the transatlantic slave trade, his fierce intellect, his insistence that Cuba told a different story about the transatlantic slave trade, and especially his work on a database about enslaved Africans liberated by an African battalion in Cuba after 1820. Immediately after the conference ended, Gwen took Jorge by the arm and marched him into the graduate director's office, where she demanded that he be immediately admitted to the PhD program. When Jorge left Cuba, he believed he would return a few days later, but Gwen convinced him to stay and await the admission committee's decision. With only the clothes that he packed for a weekend trip, Jorge worked part-time jobs in the following months, often washing dishes in restaurants and learning to perfect his language skills before he was eventually admitted to the PhD program. But Jorge's academic career did not begin serendipitously, but instead originated in Cuba at the University of Havana, when at 18 years old, he walked into Mariel Iglesias Ucet's course on Western philosophy. He later worked with her on the Cuban slavery database. Her mentorship irrevocably changed his life. Mariel's intellectual trajectory spans from Cuba to Moscow and encompasses studies from the U.S. occupation in Cuba to a trenchant analysis of a Creole family's plantation in Cuba, coffee plantation in Cuba. Her research alone is worthy of its own intellectual biography, but it has, at the very least, left an indelible mark on Jorge's scholarship. At Michigan State, Jorge was trained as an Africanist under the tutelage of both Walter Hawthorne, an African historian, and David Eltis, who has become a maverick in the demographic and statistical analysis of the slave trade. Their combined influence propelled Jorge to win a Mellon Fellowship here at the Hutchins Center in 2019, where he contributed to the Slave Voyage Database, which is a breathtaking digital memorial of the ships, traders, and captives in the Atlantic slave trade, and which Skip has described as, quote, a magical wonderland. Jorge worked on the curation and data inputting of the intra-American slave trade. He has continued working in digital humanities and has been involved in the creation of a database on coerced workers transported from Australia to the South Pacific in the second half of the 19th century. He served as a co-PI on an Australian grant, which is similar to the NEH. There are many other academic accomplishments to acknowledge, from his position as an assistant professor at UTSA, where he teaches a range of courses, including a COTAR course on Atlantic slavery with the luminary gender historian Catherine Clinton, to his groundbreaking research on the understudied role that Cuba played during the trade. But I would be remiss not to tell at least part of the story of Jorge's return to Cuba many years after he earned his PhD. He wanted to see his mother, his brother, and other friends and family. In fact, he wanted to bring a laptop for his brother, who's an engineer. But customs officials at the border would not allow him to bring technology from the United States. Customs at the Cuban border inspect every suitcase and every item that Cuban citizens bring back to the country, going so far as to counting the number of undergarments to ensure that they did not purchase even the most basic necessities while abroad. But when Jorge crossed over the border back to his home country, he carried with him so much that the police could not see: ideas about politics and democracy, history and historiography, slavery and data science. Jorge's study on the Cuban slave trade did not result from a historiographical impasse in the otherwise crowded field of slavery studies, where many scholars have become suspicious of archival records, but rather it was a quest to understand the political forces that rendered slavery almost invisible in contemporary Cuba. The act to document, the act to digitize, the act to make visible the empirical history of Cuban slavery is not merely an academic pursuit, but for Jorge, a profoundly political act, given both the politics of the past and present. Drawing on archival records from Sierra Leone, the UK, Spain, Cuba, and the United States, Jorge offers a quantitative analysis that provides the human shape of the slave trade, that upends familiar chronologies and introduces surprising historical characters. When Jorge returned to the United States, ideas about Cuba traveled with him. When protests against the Cuban government broke out in Havana in the summer of 2021, Black Lives Matter activists called for lifting the American embargo, which it says undermines Cubans' right to choose their own government. In a deftly written article in The Atlantic, Jorge explained how BLM overlooked the material conditions that left many Afro-Cubans impoverished, and Jorge cautioned BLM not to use Cuba as an empty canvas to project their own political ideas. Growing up in a predominantly poor Afro-Cuban neighborhood, Jorge used his personal observations to deflate a well-intended, misunderstood political conceit. His essay nonetheless went viral and led to subsequent publication in The Atlantic 2 weeks later, sparking his desire to become a public intellectual. In sum, Jorge's study of history is not just an intellectual exercise that has led to a career for him in the United States, but it's also a political project that seeks to organize the past and to make Cuban history visible for the present. Would you please welcome the incomparable Jorge Felipe-Gonzalez.
That was an amazing introduction, Jim. Thank you so much, amigo. Appreciate it. So this is it's a big responsibility to be the one closing the show here today. After all these brilliant minds that have been standing in this podium before me. But I want to start by thanking Krishna and Velma and Abby, especially Skip. But I want to start by thanking particularly my mentor, Marial Iglesias. I met her, well, Jim mentioned that, when I was 19 years old in my history of Western philosophy class when I was a freshman in college. I had hair, I looked different, I was skinnier. Yeah, that was 20 years ago. And since then, we started working together in this project on the transatlantic slave trade. So Maria has been a profound impact in my professional and personal life. We spent hours talking about the slave trade. We spent hours sharing documents. Part of this research and the way I look at the transatlantic slave trade and slavery at large come from Maria's ideas as well. So please give it up for Maria because this is so good to me. So today I will be talking about, not exactly about Cuba, which is my current book project. I'm working on a history of how Cuba became a slave trading nation. Instead of that, because I thought that maybe Cuba was too niche or too specific, I wanted to paint a big picture of the foundation of this system that we call this human trafficking system that we call the transatlantic slave trade. So we're going to start in the early 16th century. I might end in 1619 just because it's an important landmark, and I know because it's part of the conversation in this country, and it's important to situate this particular moment within the broader picture of the transatlantic slave trade from a hemispheric perspective. Since I want to keep this tied to 40 minutes, and it's a lot, I want to cover 1 century and 3 continents. I'm going to read my presentation, and this is how it goes. In August 2018, the New York Times Magazine launched the 1619 Project, a compendium of articles and visuals curated by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones. The project commemorates the 400th anniversary of the arrival of 20 enslaved Africans in Virginia, a historical event depicted there as the beginning of the Black experience in the United States. The central goal of my talk today is to situate 1619's Jamestown within the historical context of the preceding century, an era when that massive system of human trafficking that we call the transatlantic slave trade was constituted and enlarged. Jamestown was a distressing note within a much longer symphony of sorrow that had been playing in the Atlantic world for over a century. Before 1619, nearly 500,000 Africans had been extracted from their homelands and scattered across the Americas from today's Argentina to Mexico. Before 1619, these people and their descendants had already forged communities, led uprisings, established maroon societies, achieved freedom, or succumbed to the yoke of captivity. While pinpointing a definitive starting date for the Black experience in the United States is not my primary objective today, a windfall derived from expanding our perspective and geographical scope reveals that 1619 is not actually the right landmark. Historian Jane Landers has extensively documented the first Africans who landed in Florida in the early 16th century. Others arrived with the Spaniards who founded the town of San Miguel de Guadalupe in today's Georgia in 1526. Some had settled in Spanish San Agustin in Florida since 1562, making it the oldest African-American populated town in the United States. Thus, by moving beyond Anglo-centric narratives and transcending national boundaries, we gain a better understanding of the true magnitude of what was a multi-continental system of human trafficking. First, a small disclosure. The transatlantic slave trade is a profoundly difficult subject to both narrate and research. In my years in archive, I have encountered disturbing images of human suffering that are hard to bear. In this presentation, for ethical reasons, I will intentionally avoid the most gore depiction of violence. Cuba, 1535. After years of naming birds and plants that already had names, cutting down ancient trees and towering palms to build houses and churches, and forcing the native to scavenge soils and rivers in search of gold until both gold and native had been depleted, the intruders started abandoning the island. In their wake, they left a trail of destruction. Of the nearly 2,000 Spaniards who had invaded Cuba in 1511, only 300 remained. The first large group sailed with Hernán Cortés toward Aztec Tenochtitlan, today Mexico City. Some tried fortune in the swampy lands of Florida, while many others left for Peru, chasing the wealth found among the Incas. The colonies left behind were the elderly, the infirm, or those bound by family obligations, political duties, and business interests. People unable or unwilling to partake in the promising exodus. The letters, preserved today in the Spanish archives, convey a deep-seated sense of fear and hopelessness. 70 years old Guillermo de Huesos, a man with no wife, family, or anyone to look after him, was desperate. He lamented that, quote, the land was already lost and that everyone wanted to live, that he would have followed the others if not for his old age. Political authorities were also fleeing. The mayor of Santi Spiritus expressed that he was determined to leave a place where everything was getting worse than today. That looks like Cuba today. Even the governor, who spent years chasing people sneaking onto ships, eventually left for Peru. The Spanish exodus provided the indigenous population with a fleeting opportunity to reclaim their land. Rebellions flared up, villages were torched, and many were slain. I'm afraid, Cuban bishop wrote, that the Indians will not leave any Christian alive. Yet, another danger casts shadows on the colony. French pirates raided enfeebled Spanish villages. The worst attack happened in the summer of 1555, when the French Jacques de Sor plundered and flattened down. The villagers were picking up the pieces when another pirate showed up by the bay, only to find a woeful place with nothing left to pilfer. There were no doubts. Cuba's colonization was on the brink of failure. The colonizers knew they could not maintain control over this foreign land without reinforcement. They also knew that their fellow Iberians were unlikely to come to such a troubled place when better opportunities awaited in Mexico or Peru. Only by bringing people who couldn't choose their destination, people who had limited say in their actions, they reasoned, could their colony be safe? Could their own life be spared? Cuba needed slaves. Traigan negros, the colonists told Governor Rojas during his official visit across the colony. Juan de Espinosa, the Notary of Trinidad, begged for enslaved Africans to be bought with funds provided by the crown. Juan Pedro Carmona, who complained about the solitude of the land, petitioned the same. They all agreed that, as a report reads, only in the arrival of Africans lies the salvation of this land. There cannot be any other congruent remedy, an officer wrote, to solve the decline of these lands than to import Africans. But one thing is to express a wish, and another is actually getting what you want. And they had to tap into a machinery that had existed for over a century. It was not an extraordinary idea. Africans had lived in the Iberian Peninsula for centuries before Columbus. Although their presence could be dated to Roman times, enslaved sub-Saharan people started arriving in large numbers following the Islamic conquest of North Africa and Iberia. According to historian Ralph Austin, the trans-Saharan slave trade was responsible for the transportation of around 4.3 million people to Mediterranean ports before 1492. Additionally, from the 1440s onward, the Portuguese and other Mediterranean seafarers started nautical explorations along the west coast of Africa. By the end of that century, they had already reached the continent's southernmost tip. On their return to Europe, they also brought enslaved individuals, with the largest estimate suggesting around 80,000 people before 1492. Unsurprisingly, people of African or African descent made up between 10 and 15% of the population in larger cities like Lisbon and Seville before the arrival of Columbus to the Americas. This is to say that the transatlantic slave trade that emerged in the 16th century was not an entirely new system. It was rather an extension of Atlantic routes that had existed for decades between Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. This connection explained why the first Africans who reached the Americas came not directly from Africa, but from the Iberian Peninsula, on vessels carrying conquistadores, tools, and merchandise, in conditions starkly different from the infamous slave ship that emerged a few decades later. The initial strategy of introducing a small number of enslaved Africans fell short in supporting the need for people for colonizing purposes. A much larger, sustained, and efficient human trafficking infrastructure was necessary. A key argument I propose today is that the transatlantic slave trade was, from its inception, an intricate web of interconnected components, akin to a complex machinery. It was a system that lacked a centralized force or structure, such as a dominant empire, government, community, or ruler. There was no mastermind behind it, no Wizard of Oz pulling the strings. To understand how this synchronized intercontinental network of gears interlock to set the system in motion, we will now examine the key components of this machinery. And for that, we will start in Europe. Following Portugal's maritime expedition to West Africa and the Spanish encounter with the Americas, the Pope, divided the known world into two areas of influence. Spain had rights over the land located 370 leagues to the west of Cape Verde, while the remaining east, including Africa, would be reserved for Portugal. This resulted in an international division in human trafficking. Portugal would primarily supply captives, while Spain was the primary buyer for the New World colonies. To ensure a continuous supply of enslaved people, Spain established an administrative structure that, for the most part, existed until the late 18th century. The Crown would delegate to third parties the responsibilities of purchasing, transporting, and delivering enslaved individuals. This system of licenses, later known as asientos, became a critical source of revenue for the Crown and benefited a transnational group of affluent commercial companies and individuals. Although licenses were initially granted to bankers from different backgrounds, Genoese, Flemish, Germans, by the late 16th century, the Portuguese had fully taken over the slave trade. The Portuguese procured and transported captives to Spanish America until, in David Eltis's word, Northwestern Europeans intruded into the Iberian-dominated system. The Portuguese license or asiento holders were, however, not the ones directly involved in the on-the-ground operations. They were instead the visible heads of a trafficking web that cascaded down the trading hierarchy. The wealthy contract holders divided and sold the licenses to smaller merchants who financed, outfitted, and hired ship captains for the expedition. Captains and other ship officers, in turn, gathered the crew and oversaw the ship's loading. At this point, we are far away from the lavish Iberian palaces and castles. We are now in the realm of poor sailors, the world of taverns and cheap beer. The beating heart of the slave trade resided there, in the hands of a transnational assemblage of financiers, merchants, captains, and sailors, not in Lisbon or Madrid palaces, but in what today we would call the private sector. The distinction between governmental and private sector is vital in understanding the dynamics of human trafficking as it is in analyzing any other kind of commerce. When we employ terms like the Spanish, British, or US slave trades, we implicitly suggest that states were primary agents. In reality, private actors, not state entities, were the principal operative in the transatlantic slave trade. Actors crossing national boundaries, often seeking ways to circumvent or bend state laws, favoring the regulation to enhance their profits. For the slave traders, as it turned out, more often than not, the government was, quoting a well-known gentleman, the problem and not the solution. The executive role of merchants can be better visualized when we move our attention far from Lisbon or Madrid to the Atlantic coast of West Africa in the 1500s. The first region that joined the transatlantic slave trade stretched from today's Senegal to Sierra Leone, an ecosystem of rivers that hosts the most diverse ethno-linguistic population in West Africa. Called Upper Guinea by historians, this region supplied 89% of nearly 64,000 Africans who had landed in the Americas by the mid-16th century. Most likely, the first enslaved Africans who actually landed in the United States, those who landed in Georgia or Florida, were Upper Guineans. The three main embarkation regions were located not too far from each other, on the coastline stretched today from today's Senegal to Guinea-Bissau. Enslaved procured there were then sent to the neighboring Cape Verde, a Portuguese possession since the 1460s, where most slave ships arrived seeking human cargo. Upper Guinea pioneer role was facilitated not only by the pre-Columbian trading networks, but also by the maritime and ocean currents that connected North Atlantic Africa and the Caribbean coastlines in the age of sails. But before we turn our attention to Upper Guinea, I would like to highlight a critical point. In my years of teaching the transatlantic slave trade, I have often encountered a widespread belief that at some point in the past, the all-powerful Europeans arrived in their large sailing ships and coerced peaceful rulers, chiefs, and villagers into selling their people. Another, even more simplistic yet widespread belief, posits that European sailors armed with their muskets got off their ships and kidnapped terrified villagers. The consensus among experts in African history, including scholars like John Thornton, Walter Hawthorne, Mariana Candido, and Boubacar Barry, is conclusive. Africans, an umbrella term that I will use for now to refer to a universe of people from different polities, regions, and languages across 10,000 miles of continental coastline, were powerful decision makers during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. They controlled the supply of captives, negotiated with Europeans, defined the nature of the operations in their dominions, and set the rules in their lands. Understanding this fundamental dynamic is crucial for several reasons. First, it clarifies the mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade. Second, it offers a clearer picture of the fragmented nature of the Atlantic human trafficking machinery, and, what I consider to be most important, it cleanses our understanding of the past from ideologically racialized and colonial-driven narrative that strip agency from Africans. During the first voyage along the Senegal estuary, the Portuguese attempted to obtain what they wanted by force, by raiding villages and kidnapping people. As Senegalese historian Boubacar Barry has shown, Senegambians possessed a sophisticated military and maritime culture capable of protecting their own land. So, the invaders were consistently repelled and had to conform to the rules of trade. From the perspective of Senegambian merchants and rulers, the Portuguese represented just another opportunity to expand their trade beyond their internal markets. Since commerce, not conquest, ultimately became the leading form of interaction, the next logical step for the Iberians was to integrate themselves into the fabric of those societies in which they wanted to conduct trade. Early forms of Portuguese accommodations have been well studied by historians. I will outline only its broad components. To settle and build commercial outposts, the newcomers had to adhere to local rules of etiquette, diplomacy, and subordination. They follow what George Brooks once described as the autochthonous relationship between strangers, the newcomers, and the landlords, the Africans. The strangers had to request authorization from the landlords, be it a king or a head of a more decentralized community or villages, by offering tributes, forging alliances, pledging submission, and agreeing to defend the land in case of aggression. Assimilation also entailed building kinships. When successful in their enterprises, the newcomers had to espouse women related to the elite. In polygamous societies, these unions enabled the formation of political alliances between foreign merchants and the ruling class. It is important to note, however, that these women were not necessarily passive actors. Sometimes they were, in fact, the decision makers, as historians Vanessa Oliveira and Hilary Jones have shown with the case of the so-called African señoras or doñas. The union between Portuguese men and African women resulted in a progeny of mixed heritage, often called Eurafricans, who became influential figures in West Africa, political leaders, and cultural brokers. They played a central role in local politics in the years to come. Once settled and ready to trade, the newcomers had to link with merchants from the interior, the people who carried the captives to the coast. To better illustrate the mechanism of enslavement from the interior to the coast, let us focus on the political and ethnic landscape of the region extending from the Gambia River in the north to the Geba River in the south, from Senegal to Guinea-Bissau. 16th century Upper Guinea was typical in that warfare, kidnapping, or raids were the principal vehicles for enslavement. By the 16th century, the dominant kingdom in Upper Guinea was Kabu, a federation of Mande states that had risen from the disintegration of the Empire of Mali. Kabu enlarged its power by subjugating neighboring coastal communities, such as the Biafada, Balanta, Brame, Flub, Banyun, and Kasanga people. Let us take the case of the Kasanga people, who inhabited the land between the Casamance and Cachor rivers. The Kasanga waged war against their neighbors, the Flub, Balanta, and Brame. However, one of their primary targets was the Banyu people, who resided on the northern side of the Casamance River. The Banyu did not remain passive spectators of these foreign aggressions. They retaliated by capturing Kasanga, but they also enslaved others, such as the Floop and Brame. As Hawthorne has shown, other groups in the region, such as the Balanta and the Biafada, were often in war, enslaving each other. This relentless correlation between warfare and enslavement was not a diversion from a historical norm or a historical pattern. Communities enslaved those they perceived as the other, foreign, or alien. This behavior was not unique to Africans either. The Castilians enslaved Slavs, the Greeks enslaved Circassians, the Vikings enslaved Britons, and the Caribs enslaved Arawaks. This is also to say that in every practical sense, this is important, Africans did not enslave Africans. The Kasanga enslaved the Banyu, and the Banyu enslaved the Floop. The formation of Africanness as a shared identity was a historically complex process studied by multiple historians. It likely began to take root when, in the cramped bottom of a sailing ship, a Banyu man looked at the eyes of his Kasanga shipmate, and both understood their fate. Warfare predated the Portuguese arrival. It was rooted in conflict lost in the annals of time. If anything, the newcomers took advantage of these conflicts. That being said, most historians have shown that the rise of the Atlantic slave trade catalyzed wars in the interior or even buttressed the creation of predatory enslaving states. The long-term consequences of the Atlantic slave trade in Africa are still a subject of debate. Once trapped in the wheels of war, people were transported to the coast in caravans that covered hundreds of miles. One such enclave in the mid-16th century was Bugendo, a Portuguese-owned outpost in Upper Guinea. At Bugendo, negotiations between the Portuguese and caravan leaders were also placed. Although presenting a detailed description of this stage is beyond our scope here, it could be broadly said that, like in everything already described, the Portuguese had to follow customary rules, offer lodging the caravan heads, and pay tributes or taxes to the landlords. I would like to draw attention to an aspect that consistently emerged from the historical records. It is particularly troubling and heart-rending, which is a lot to say in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. This trafficking machinery would have not functioned effectively for over 3 centuries without the active involvement of large segments of the population. Ordinary people, not particularly evil or particularly good, people invested in raising their own families and protecting their communities. Porters, farmers, cattle ranchers, carpenters, coopers, cooks, ironsmiths. Slave trading outposts, such as the one at Bugendo, were supported by villages catering to the slave trade. Farmers sold their crops, cooks made the meals for the captives, others sustained and guarded the slaves in the barracoons, and some repaired incoming ships. Skilled sailors, called the crewmen, drove the canoes that loaded the victims onto vessels. After an arduous day of paddling, these men returned home, where the family awaited with a steamy bowl of rice seasoned with Malagueta peppers. Around the 1580s, the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade started moving south to the region known by historians as West Central Africa. Thanks to the scholarship of historians John Thornton and Linda Haywood, we know a great deal about the early interactions between the Portuguese and the West Central African people. In the 1480s, Portuguese explorers encountered the Kingdom of Congo, a sizable, powerful state that had existed for over a century. One of its most renowned rulers was King Afonso Mbenga Nsinga, who seized the opportunity of Portuguese arrival to consolidate his power while undertaking major reforms in the kingdom, including expanding Catholicism and establishing commercial ties with Lisbon and the Vatican. Afonso exemplifies the agency that Africans exerted during the foundational era of the transatlantic slave trade. He corresponded directly with the King of Portugal as his brother, sent ambassadors to Europe, and appointed members of the nobility to Rome. Afonso's correspondence, published in 2023 by John Thornton, offered glimpses into that relationship. West Central Africa, much like Upper Guinea, was also politically unstable, with states vying for power amid internal dissensions. The Portuguese capitalized on this conflict, forging alliances with competing factions to extend their regional influence. Their maneuvers eventually enabled them to dominate the Kingdom of Nongo along the Kwanza River with the aid of the fierce Imbangala warriors. Despite resistance, Dongo ultimately became the foundation of Portuguese Angola. The rise of West Central Africa coincided with the rapid expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. As this graph shows, the flow of captives to the Americas reached its first peak around 1620, around the time that the events of Jamestown occurred. A few reasons explain this first peak. Warfare in West Central Africa led to an increase in the number of prisoners. Concurrently, there was a rising demand for coerced labor in the Americas as the Spanish Empire solidified. Finally, from 1580 to 1640, Portugal and Spain became a single state in what historians call the Iberian Union, a development that placed the supply and the demand under a single polity. The demographic consequences were devastating, as financiers and captains attempted to maximize profit by loading more people in the ships. Conditions during the transatlantic crossing deteriorated significantly. Tight packing, poor sanitation, physical and psychological abuse, malnutrition, dehydration, and suicides increased the mortality rates from 10 to about 25%. The number of women and children being transported also increased. During the Nongo Wars, male warriors were more likely to be executed, while children and women were sold in Luanda. Drawing upon Havana notarial records, historians De La Fuente and David Witt have confirmed that women comprise over 40% of the arrivals, and children under 14, nearly a quarter of the total. The ascent of West Central Africa altered the ethnic demographic of the enslaved population in the Americas. By the early 17th century, most Africans brought to the Americas spoke either Kikongo or Kimbundu. Some had been converted to Catholicism in their land or syncretized their indigenous belief with the monotheistic faith. There was another consequence derived from the late 16th century expansion of the transatlantic slave trade: the full-fledged Africanization of bondage, or the association of slavery with people from a specific region and skin color, a culmination of a historical process dating back centuries. As in late medieval Spain, in early colonial America, enslaved Africans shared their status with people of diverse backgrounds. Now, by the first quarter of the 17th century, bondage had been confined to a more restricted sphere. Now that we have established the key elements of the old world components of the trade, we can shift our attention to the New World, to Spanish Americas in the 1500s. In the 1990s, a group of historians led by David Eltis, David Richardson, Herbert Klein, and Stephen Berendt, and supported by our own Henry Louis Gates, gathered existing data on the transatlantic slave trade under a single digital platform, a CD-ROM. Over the past 2 decades, historians worldwide have contributed data to what is now the online site slavevoyages.org. As of the latest update in January 2018, the database contains records of around 36,000 expeditions from which users can extract information across hundreds of variables, including the number of captives, ship names, nationalities, and incidents or rebellions, just to mention a few. Unfortunately, the database's weakest period remained the 16th century. Still, the data is sufficient to identify patterns pertaining to the dispersion of Africans within the Americas. Broadly, 16th century Africans landed in 3 main regions: the Greater Antilles, the Caribbean coast of Colombia and Mexico, and the Southern Cone. To better explain the dispersion of Africans to a modern audience, I have organized the data according to present-day countries. Excluding the over 70,000 for whom we do not have precise information, Colombia leads the list as the primary destination for enslaved Africans, with approximately 130,000 people. Mexico follows with 111,000, the Dominican Republic with around 24,000, and the combined nation of Argentina and Uruguay with 32,000. It is important to note that in the New World, much like in Europe and Africa, the human trafficking system relied on private actors entailing a whole universe of commoners, merchants, muleteers, porters, and canoe peddlers. Contraband was also rampant, which is why accessing data from this period is so challenging. By placing the data against the backdrop of historical events, it becomes clear that the destination of Africans were directly determined by the directions of the Spanish conquest. In the first 2 decades of the 1500s, the slave trade was mostly circumscribed to the headquarters of the Spanish colonization of the New World, Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. In fact, if we really aim to find the origins of the black experience in the Americas, the place to go is the island of Hispaniola, today's the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Hispaniola was not only the testing ground for African bondage and sugar production in the Americas, but also the site of the first recorded slave rebellion in the Western Hemispheres in 1521. Following the conquest of Mexico, the port of Veracruz emerged as a leading point of entry for captives, surpassing Hispaniola around the 1530s. The later conquest of Peru led, once again, to a rearrangement of slave trading routes. In the southern cone, Buenos Aires rose as a significant disembarkation port around 1590. But without a doubt, Cartagena de Indias was the main entry point for captives until the 1630s. The human toll in Cartagena was such that the first strong complaints against the brutality of the slave trade were formulated in that city by members of the church. As historian Greco Mali has shown, the port or regions of disembarkations were not, in most cases, the final destination of captives. According to historian Pablo Sierra, many Africans brought to Veracruz were then transported to towns like Puebla or Mexico, traversing hundreds of miles. Meanwhile, those arriving in Cartagena were then transported into the Pacific coast, while those captives disembarked in ports like Portobelo, crossed by the foot the Isthmus of Panama, were embarked on ships heading across the Pacific and ended up in Quito. Another route carried captives from the Rio de la Plata over the Andes, extending thousands of miles to Potosi or Lima. By 1619, what are now major cities in Latin America had, in fact, a sizable black population aiming to build a new life. Now, considering this thick background, we can place 1619 Jamestown within the broader picture. The 20 people who landed in Virginia were a small fraction of 350 captives who had embarked in Luanda on the Portuguese ship São João Bautista. The ship, unsurprisingly, was bound for Veracruz, Mexico. Before reaching its destination, 2 British privateers captured the ship. One of them, the White Lion, sailed to Jamestown, where it sold his plunder, consisting of human beings and merchandise.
I have to say, I like the ships. That's very cool.
Thank you. Had this seizure never occurred, Jamestown captives would have most likely ended up in the hinterland of Mexico, instead of the nascent British settlement, with the descendants speaking Spanish instead of English. By 1619, 500,000 people had been removed from their homelands, but the worst was about to come. Over the next 2 centuries, 1,200 million more were forcibly taken from Africa, funneled through a relentless and ruthless machinery operating with unprecedented intensity and speed. About 2 million of them lost their life crossing the Atlantic Ocean. In the end, Cuba's conquistadores achieved their goals. Africans arrived and saved the colony from its impending demise. In a counterfactual scenario in which Africans had never arrived, Cuba's historical trajectory might have been drastically different. Conceivably, indigenous rebels could have wiped out the Spaniards or the French, prolonged their presence, perhaps even establishing settlement as they did in later decades on other Caribbean islands. Fortresses, roads, churches, convents would have remained unbuilt, crippling Havana's ability to host the silver fleet that fed Europe's financial revolution. Africans fundamentally shaped Cuba as we know it. Yet, the history of Africans and their descendants in the Americas encompassed much more than just the totalitarian structure of bondage. By the 16th century, Havana's black population had become the majority in the city. It is estimated that between 10 and 25% of them were free, women notably among them. The Iberian colonies, the same people that decades earlier were writing motions to bring more Africans, took notice and started worrying. As early as the 1560s, Havana's delegates sent a request to Madrid to deport the city's free black population to Florida, as they, quoting, were harmful for the Republic and, quoting, called themselves king and queens. Right there, members of the free black community organized what could be considered one of the first recorded instances of black political activism in the Americas. They sent letters to the king, presenting themselves as loyal vassals of their majesty, listing all the mistreatments and the looming threat of expulsion. After 2 decades of litigation, a royal order reminded the colonial elite that the free blacks of Havana were his majesty vassals, and as such, belonged on the island. It was only the beginning. From the 16th century onward, people of African and African descent led a wave of activism across every major city in the Americas, from Buenos Aires and Lima to Quito, Cartagena, and Mexico. They created a space for themselves in the colonial world. They built businesses, established brotherhoods, served in the military, cleared dense jungles to build maroon communities, craft artworks, and, on countless occasions, rose up in rebellions. The last slave ship to reach the Western Hemisphere arrived in Cuba in 1867. About 2 decades later, in 1888, when light bulbs were starting to illuminate homes and phonographs recording songs, the nation of Brazil became the last country to end slavery. It was a long road, but at the end, no machinery, no matter how oppressive, large, or complex, can stop the forces of good from bending the moral arc of the universe toward justice. Thank you.
Home run. That was great.
I can breathe now.
Really. That was brilliant. And it's so important, particularly for African Americans, to know this history because we were raised on this fantasy that, I mean, it starts in Roots. Not starts in Roots, but the most vivid image for anyone in my generation is, you know, white people jumping out of the bushes and kidnapping your black ancestors, you know, in the opening scene of Roots. It just didn't happen that way. The one historian estimates that 99% of the Africans who were brought over were captured by other Africans. And you, as you say, it's anachronistic to use the word African. We do it for convenience, but Wolof connecting the, capturing the Fulani, you know, or whatever it was. One of the most important things you said, and it was so subtle, was, and it's something Mariel and I have talked about, is that to deny the African role in the slave trade is to deny people of African descent agency.
Exactly.
We're just like other human beings.
Exactly.
Just as avaricious, greedy. And you didn't mention, even more shocking to me, is the fact that many slave ships had translators. You know, one of the other myths we have is that all these people were thrown into the hold of a ship. They couldn't talk to each other. Many of the ships had translators on who were, you know, translating between and African sailors on the slave ship. It was enormously complicated, and the myths on which we were raised, these fantasies, we can't begin to understand the complexity of African history, the complexity of slavery, the complexity of the interaction of people of African descent and people of European descent, the settling of the New World, the history of the United States, until everything that you said becomes commonplace in our understanding about the history of slavery, particularly before 1619. I love it. You know, you were preaching to the choir right here. It was great. One thing I want people to know is the image of the African king was not a real person. He was Prester John, the mythical king of Ethiopia. And historians have underplayed the role that the myth of Prester John played in driving Henry the Navigator and all these other people They were looking for the richest king in the world who had the fountain of youth. And all these army and all, because they wanted to enlist his help to take back Jerusalem, to defeat the Saracens. That's often left out. You know, when in my generation we were taught that it was the drive for spices that navigated Henry. Nobody talked about some mythical black king of Ethiopia, which is, you know, an important omission. I love this. And if you could send me the slide with the 1526, the 1539, and then 1565, I want to send it to a friend of mine. I mean, he's on Wall Street, but just so that we can see that there were black people in Florida before there were black people in. But the problem is that Spain lost, so all that history, you know, was flushed, and history starts with the British because the British were telling their story. Anyway, I loved it. Let's see if your mentor wants to come. Got any footnotes there? You want to tell him he made a mistake?
Can I speak when I speak?
Yes, you can.
Wonderful. Yeah. I have a question. You didn't mention, because one of the explanation, and I'm thinking about Jim work, it's the epidemiological factor. You know, in the Caribbean, Native Americans were dying out of diseases. They didn't have antibodies. That's part of the bigger picture of what Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange. And the Caribbean basically lost the original population in just a few years. So they had to bring Africans, and the fact that the Africans were exposed to yellow fever, malaria, was one of the main explanations to keep bringing them, because they survived, you know. So I would like to know what you have to say about that, you know, epidemiological factor behind it.
As you mentioned, certainly the diseases, the old world diseases wipe out, I think it's 90% of the indigenous population. By it is estimated that, I think the largest estimated said that about 100,000
90% of the population
in one generation. Yeah, in one generation.
Yeah,
That means that you see everyone around you dying, almost everyone around you dying in just a single generation. And that was a major crisis. And I didn't mention also that the first attempt, I can understand slavery as a parasitical institution. These people operate as parasites, trying to use the new house to colonize. And the first try that they did was to bring enslaved people from other islands. They brought them from Yucatan, what they call the Caribs, but that didn't work out either. So by the 1530s, they were asking for Africans. But the epidemiological factor certainly is probably, I would say probably the most determinant factor, deciding the moment in which they start importing enslaved Africans to the island.
Just one footnote. If you're wondering where your ancestors came from, what the likelihood, we made a map for genealogical purposes of the origins of the 388,000 Africans who came to the United States. More Africans went to what is now Mexico and Peru than came to the United States, which is totally counterintuitive, and most people would never even believe that. Yeah. But of the black people in this room, well, let me put it this way. Of the 388,000, 25% came from Congo, Angola. 25% came from Senegal and Senegambia. So that's half. 16% came from Eastern Nigeria, Igbo predominantly. I think 14% from what is now Ghana, et cetera, so that you can see the likelihood of your ancestry just from the numbers.
Yes.
Right.
And probably a statistic that is not very well known is that before 1820, most of the people who crossed from the old world to the new world were actually Africans, no Europeans. I think four out of five people who crossed the Atlantic to the Americas before 1820 were Africans, no Europeans. So the population of the old world to the New World was mostly African, not European.
Talk about the Great Migration, right?
Yeah, that's a great forced migration. Yeah.
Yeah. Questions, comments?
Okay, so I thought it was terrific. I thought it was brilliant. I loved all of the slides. I loved the pictorial illustrations. Just on Marielle's point too, I don't think it challenges your talk, but maybe talking more about the epidemiological facts, just because if you go through the primary material, there's all of these threats of smallpox epidemics. There's one recent study that said there was something like 670 outbreaks of smallpox alone from Africa to the Americas. So I think it doesn't disrupt or upend your argument. I think it would just enrich it. My point or my question was, I'm really fascinated by your analysis of the Iberian coast, and you sort of bring that back in the very beginning of the at the very end of the presentation, where you're talking about the free black population in Cuba. I just was hoping you could expand a little bit more on that, on the sort of connections between those enslaved people who were in the Iberian coast and then the people who eventually, how that affects the transatlantic slave trade and what happens in Cuba later on.
So just to make sure, it's about the free black population, how it became
right, because you seem to mention, you bring it back up at the end, this piece about the free black population, and I thought you were connecting it to the Iberian group. Were you or not, or was that my misunderstanding?
What I was trying to do is, since I started with this sort of like a snapshot of Cuba in the 1530s, and these colonizers desperate because everything was falling apart, and Indians were killing their people, invading villages and pirates. I wanted to go back to that same place 30 years later. Now with the Africans who actually arrived, but not only arrived, they created a large community. They became the majority of the population by the mid-16th century, and around a quarter of them were free. And as free people, they founded brotherhoods. They have their own neighborhoods. They were part of the militia. And that case specifically is because for the lack of, that's probably anachronistic to say, but the white people freak out. That's actually what happened. And they wanted them out. And they got together, a closed door, and sent a letter to the king, we need to get rid of these people. And these people knew about it. And they sent a letter to the king, they organized themselves. And they sent the letter to the king, and the king sent back saying, these people are my vassals and they belong on the island. And the point I was trying to make is that cases like these are not exceptional. This is just part of the bigger picture of Latin America of free black communities carving a space in the colonial world, which is something that has been studied by multiple historians since the 16th century, including Alejandro Lafuente for the case of Cuba. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So we saved the best for the last, and the controversial for the last. So I really, really liked the way you explained the logic of the slave trade, at least on the African part, and how it was really small merchants and so on, and the interaction between farmers and, the detail is amazing. I like that you are bringing up this issue of agency too, that Africans had agency, and of course revising, as Skip said, the usual narrative that we used to get from roots and other sources like that. I'm just curious, when you teach this history like this, like the way you've given it to us, to your students, how do they respond? So that's my first question. And my second question is, some of what you said reminded me of John Miller's Way of Death.
Yes.
So where he traces the history of the slave trade from Angola to Lisbon to Brazil and so on. I guess, are you in conversation with that book?
Oh, 100%. I love that book.
Okay. So those are my
now I regret that I didn't mention I'm on the top Africanist, but he's an excellent,
by the way.
Way of Death is an excellent book. And
I had to give it,
yeah, I had to read it I read it twice when I was taking my PhD classes on African history, and then after that for my own book. It's an excellent, excellent piece of scholarship. And I definitely was inspired by that scholar as well. My students, when I teach a course called a graduate course called Teaching and Researching the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the Digital Age. It's basically how to use digital tools to teach and research this subject. That's what I do in that class. But when I start pinpointing all this, I think my students tend to have the whole history upside down. Like, for example, they believe that slavery is an anomaly. It's an exception. And something that I always said when I start my class, actually, the idea of freedom, not slavery, is the exception in human history. And that's been hanging around for 3 centuries, and it's kind of shaky anyways. And the slavery itself as an institution, bondage as an institution, is ubiquitous. That's one thing, and that makes them think a lot, and you have a lot of questions. Sometimes they feel uncomfortable. Another issue had to do with this idea of roots. I have the impression, since I didn't grow up now, that Skip mentioned that probably these fantasies, or not fantasies, imaginary about the relationship between Europeans and Africans is based on television and TV shows. I have the impression that probably that's the case. So my students, when they heard this, they assume, and then they go into all debate about blaming, the blaming game, which is way far from what I'm trying to accomplish. I just wanted to understand the system. Yeah. And that usually generated debates between students. And they usually go to this point out, that means that Africans sell Africans. I say, well, no, not really. Africans didn't sell Africans in the way you understand it, or what you want. The point that you want to make is not that point. I know where you're going to, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the Fula enslaved the Bai, and the Mandinga enslaved the Suso. Africans didn't enslave Africans in the way we understand today. That's an anachronistic and politically used tool sometimes in the present, but that's not exactly what happened in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. That was an excellent talk, and I'm also interested in this notion, and I think it's really important that you point out the fact that slavery was not exceptional, right, in human history. And I can remember going to York, where there's this museum about the Vikings, and they talk about it as Jorvik, the town, and that Vikings enslaved Anglo-Saxons, Britons. You mentioned it, right? So Romans enslaved white people had enslaved other white people, as it were. So there's an interesting relationship between conquest, as you said, and I guess a kind of colonial exploitation and slavery. But often, I think, and maybe this is something it would be interesting for you to expand on, often there's the distinction with transatlantic slavery and race, I think, which is made. And I think it's interesting you also kept referring to the machine, right? So there's this industrialized system that is brought into play, which I think makes that slavery unique in the ways that in the Viking world you could work your way out of slavery. You could, of course, in the Americas, but there's also the argument that racism didn't necessarily precede transatlantic slavery. Of course it did, but there were aspects of that you can see, but probably closer to something like xenophobia, or where skin color was not so fetishized. And I think that there's an argument that the transatlantic slavery kind of racism was invented to justify that system, which made it much more concrete. So I just wonder if we could, do you think there was something really exceptional about the transatlantic slavery which brought along, if you like, a much more mechanized, industrialized, and extremely racialized sense to that system that made it harder to work your way out of, as when African tribes, if you like, or peoples within Africa enslaved each other, you could work your way out of that system much more easily. And so those groups who were in Africa were also probably less aware of what would happen to those who were then transported across the Atlantic. Because, anyway, I'll stop there.
No, that's a good question. That's a bunch of good questions. Starting by the end, I don't remember where I heard or read something that Africans didn't know what was going on the other side of the Atlantic, especially like rulers. These people travel across the ocean. Africans, merchants, they traveled to Charleston, they traveled to Havana, they went to Lisbon, they went to Liverpool, they went to Rio de Janeiro, and they came back, so they know what was going on. They were not unknowledgeable. They knew that these people were transported not to be eaten, like many of those who actually didn't know, the victims actually didn't know what was going on with them. But the merchants and the rulers, they travel and they know what's happening in the Americas.
The same with the sailors and the translators.
Yes.
There were people going back and forth. They knew exactly what was happening.
They knew exactly that was happening. They were landed, they were disembarked, they were sold to work in plantation, in households or whatnot. And they were not only merchants and rulers, but also sailors, they were translators, just common people who were. And the reason why that happened is actually going back to epidemiology, is because often the highest rate of mortality in the transatlantic slave trade actually was among sailors, the white sailors. When they arrive to Africa, many of them tend to die, in some cases half of the crew. So if you're a captain, what are you going to do? You're going to hire people to go back, to take your ship back to Africa. Who are you, to the Americas? Who are you going to hire? Sailors. Who are the sailors? Africans. Crewmen, people who were free, people who know how to sail a ship, and they went back. They landed the captives and they came back to their homelands. In some cases, they rebelled. Like I'm writing an article with Mariala about a slave ship in which these free Africans led a rebellion. So that's one thing.
Yeah, led the rebellion and then went back to Africa.
And resold the slaves.
And resold the slaves.
Yeah. It's complicated. It's human. It's just human beings doing what human beings do. That's what we're talking about. And the other question is regarding about if race predates. I think that I agree with you, the idea that there is this, in order for slavery to exist and function, you have to have a notion of otherness. And that otherness could be defined by anything, by physical markers, religion, language, you name it. And race eventually became the otherness per excellence with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, while at the same time serving as an ideological justification for the extraction, because there was a major debate in the 16th and 17th century Iberian War if this was a legit thing to do. And they agreed that this was a legit thing to do because that's a just war and theological debates in Rome and whatnot. And ultimately that became justified by race, and especially in the post-Enlightenment era. Is that the question? I don't know if I'm leaving something behind. Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for this presentation, Jorge. You definitely are a deep-dived public intellectual for sure. Your presentation style, everything, very engaging. So I'm going to say a few things because how complex this whole the whole machine is, and how each actor is implicated, whether they be Africans or people of different ethnicities within Africa, and even Europeans who, I suppose, did not identify themselves as a unit called Europe or Europeans at that time as well. There are a couple of things that I noted. You cited in one of your slides the Borno Empire, right? The Kanem Borno Empire, and how some of the enslaved people were actually moved eastward rather than the transatlantic route. And I remember, even while I was doing my work, how the memory of that in some ways still is retained somewhat in how people perceive the impact of Islam within those regions. So it might be something you and I might want to talk about after this presentation. But I wondered if you would perhaps centralize two themes in your paper, and the two things that jumped out for me were crises and commerce, because it seems like there has to be a crisis, and then there is the instrumentality of commerce through which people then sort of extract resources. Yes. And that is how society has, sort of evolved and developed, or sort of even, devolved, as it were. So perhaps there might be a way in which you could use those two themes, perhaps, to sort of center why this is so, and perhaps why these different enslaved people were moved to, to Mexico and to these other regions before they even came to America, and why there were more people in these enslaved in these regions than there were in America.
Right.
So crises and commerce,
Okay.
and obviously it then devolved to a very predatory form. But the important thing is that there was a crisis that they perceived, whether it's writ large or writ small, there was crises, and then the commerce became the instrumentality for
Right.
Expansion, as
That's
it
a
were.
good frame. Thank you for the question. You need, however, a balance between crisis and peace, because if not, the system doesn't work. What I mean by that is that take the factory or the slave trading outpost at Bugendo, right, Guinea-Bissau. That area needs to be in peace, because if not, trade is not going to work. You need ships arriving, you need people farming, selling the crops to the people who are in the barracoons. That need peace. What you need is what African historians call the enslaving frontier. So you need an outside world which is actually in crisis. So those people can be captured and brought to the coast, because if there is conflict in the coast and crisis, the whole system collapses. So you need an equilibrium between places peaceful and places outside where you have warfare. And in relation to the contrast between Spanish Americas and Anglo-American world, I think that's another case of the history upside down. The Iberians were the ones who dominated the slave trade. They started the slave trade and they ended up the slave trade. They dominated the slave trade until the 1640, and from the 18th century, from 1808 up until the 1860s, they also dominated the slave trade.
So Portugal is number one.
Portugal, exactly. The Iberians were Spain, Portugal, then Cuba at the end. The space in between is the Northwestern Europeans, the British, the Dutch, and the French. So they were what historian Eltis has called the intruders into the system. So by the time Jamestown was founded, the British were just starting to scratch the surface of the slave trade. The Iberians were the one doing it. And in fact, the Dutch, who predated the British, learned from the Portuguese and the Iberians how to do it, because this is a business. You need to learn from other people how do you do this type of business. So that was a transference of technology that goes all the way for 3 centuries until Cuba. Cubans were the last one who learned how to tap into the slave trade in the 19th century.
But the top 5, Portugal,
Yes,
Brazil, number 1.
number 1,
Spain, number 2.
yes.
Then,
The British were.
and then the Dutch.
And then you have the French, and then you have the Dutch. But just Brazil imported 4.5 million individuals.
Yeah.
About the half.
Yeah.
Less,
Yeah,
just Brazil.
just Brazil. About the half of the whole slave trade.
I'd like to commend you twice. One for beginning your study with philosophy, and commend you again by the beautiful maps you showed, which took laser focus of 80 eyes in this room onto your topic. We have an essay on the imperative of placement. And so to have those place names, I'll just take my notes, Kabu, Bandu, they're placed, they're not just rhythmic names.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the imperative of placement, and I congratulate you on the cartographic displays.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Art.
Oh, my nose. Thank you. You opened up a whole new world for me. I really appreciate the period of time you covered and the area. And it was, of course, beautifully delivered, and I just want to add my voice to that. I had a couple of comments and a question. You know that I do antiquity, and of course, slavery. The Egyptians are forever capturing thousands of slaves and enslaving them and sending them to the gold mines and so forth. So that's nothing new. And also, the ancient Nubians are, if not a matriarchal society, there's great importance of women in ancient Nubia. And I think from what little I know of the rest, later African history, that's something that carries through. So it's just an interesting tie between your mention of the power of women. Women had overarching power in ancient Nubia, sometimes in subtle ways. But my question was about the role of the Arabs in the slave trade. I know Khartoum was a mega center of the slave trade, obviously much later. Did that East-West corridor play any role in the slave trade? What about the East Africans and so forth?
Yes, thank you for the question, the Arabs. As I mentioned, the beginning, the first large waves of enslaved Africans or sub-Saharan Africans arrived to the Iberian Peninsula came through Arab networks that crossed the Sahara Desert. And particularly after the Islamic conquest of North Africa following the 8th century, as you probably know, Spain and Portugal, what we is now Spain and Portugal, were pretty much part of the Arab world for about 800 years, which is more than what the Americas has been colonized or were colonized. So that means that it is not clear if Spain is part of Africa or is part of Europe. That's part of the historical contrast. But there was another trade going all the way from the East Africa, Tanzania, for Arab traders that were taking Africans to the Arabian Peninsula, that through maritime routes before the transatlantic slave trade. When the Portuguese reached that area around the early 16th century, they reached the southernmost tip of what is now South Africa in the 1580s. By the 1590s, they had reached that area, and they encountered networks that were already in place.
Right.
And they tapped into those networks. And those networks were Arab traders that were transporting people from those areas to the Arabic world. The slave trade from Africa actually didn't end in the 1860s. The trans-Saharan slave trade continued until the 20th century.
Yesterday.
Yeah, and that's something that is an important piece of this story. And yeah.
But very few, if you think about it, logistics made it virtually impossible to be bringing Africans from East Africa all the way down and around. And if you look at the slave trade database, what if like 1,800 people came from Madagascar?
Oh yeah.
Something about 2,000. In Mozambique, just a few, because it was impractical. It would take forever, you know, to get around.
It's a long, long journey from Mozambique to a place like Havana or Haiti.
One of the most important maps he showed, but you didn't have time to gloss it, was the map of the currents. If you wanted to sail from Luanda to Portugal, you sailed to Brazil. It was much faster to sail to Brazil and then back because of the currents and the winds. We don't think of it that way. And we also think of Brazil, we think of Rio as being right under Boston, but it's not. It's halfway. If you're Africa, Rio's over there, and I'm the United States. Yeah, it's like right next door, really. I mean, when you think about it, like see how close it is.
Yeah, until the invention.
Going to Brazil was just like a cakewalk.
Until the invention of steam technology, you have to rely on these highways, natural highways, to move around because only with the steam technology people could actually do straight lines. It is estimated that, by the way, around 11, there were around 11 or 12 steam vessels who transported Africans. That's how late this lasted. That there were steamships transporting Africans from Africa to Cuba in the mid-19th century.
Wow, that's mind-blowing.
Yeah. Coming in steam technology, which makes a difference, going back to your question, in the terms of the industrial difference with, yeah.
She's been trying to ask this question.
Can I just make a comment about East Africa? Just to say that the process that you described for Western Africa also applies to East Africa. Kind of the, like the Arabs were also tapping into what was already existing there. Most of them ended up taking slaves from East Africa and coast to the Arabian Peninsula and to the islands of Zanzibar and so on, and Mauritius and so on.
So right, and from the perspective of Cabo, the kingdom I showed, the Portuguese arrival was another opportunity to continue selling Africans. They were selling already through the trans-Saharan route. Right. It's just another business opportunity.
Now, nobody talk before she talks.
Thank you so much. I like that you named it, before 1619. I think my entry into the larger understanding of the of blackness in the Americas was kind of in response to this 1619 being an inaccurate date. Mm-hmm. How do you understand the centering of the United States and the diaspora in the ways that we don't look to the rest of European powers in terms of enslavement, right? I think because here we center the United States and its role in slavery, we're kind of obtuse in recognizing, like you say, the Portuguese started and ended it. What have you encountered kind of with students about that your United States-centric understanding, and how do you address the importance of expanding beyond the United States when we talk about it? And I guess another question is, not being from the United States, what are the narratives that you grew up learning about, or comparing to what we learned in the US about slavery and what you learned in Cuba about it?
Interesting. That's a great question. It's a great question for several reasons. And one is that because I actually tell this to my students a lot. I grew up also with a national center history, in which slavery in Cuba, or slavery, that was the slavery. We know less about the US than we knew about Cuba. That's the purpose of teaching history in high school, is to create an imagined community, an idea of a nation. And that's why we learn history in high school. And that's what I learned, barely, because the subject of slavery is not something that we discuss that much, I have to say. But when it's mentioned, it's Cuba the center. Now, why the US have that perspective? I would say it's a combination between that national center that every country have with steroids with the imperial mindset. It's like enhanced with the imperial mindset, in which we either are the best saviors of the world, or we are the worst things that have ever happened. Depends what political position you want to assume. And I think that imperial mindset is kind of what explains this self-centered narrative. Now, how you overcome that? I guess by learning, and probably by how that narrative could be overcome by a little bit of humbleness, in the sense that humbleness is like, we are not the center. There is a whole history that predates this, and that history could be a big, more excruciating history of human suffering, even more than we know it here. So that's interesting. Expanding the frame, I think, is a call for humbleness, I guess. Yeah.
And Mariel, in his research, has added hundreds of thousands of, is that right? How many Africans have been added to the database because of the research?
We are talking about nearly 400 slave voyages. We're talking, thousands of people. We used to believe that Cuba imported around 700,000. We now know that we are close to 1 million, 960,000. With the numbers of the database and new research, archival research, and the work of Maria and I and historians working in the 16th century in the Spanish archive, and that's a change.
We have time for one more question.
Jorge, that was incredible, and I really appreciate the centering and the global perspective, because it continues to have devastating consequences in policies and how we see it manifested across the world. But from my viewpoint, growing up in a binational region in San Diego and in Tijuana, we've seen the movement of people, especially people from Africa and people from the Caribbean, in a country, through a country that has very little understanding of its connection to the slave trade, in Mexico in particular. Mm-hmm. And so up until recently, as you well know, and many probably here, the participation in the census of Afro-Mexicans wasn't even included until the last 10 years or so. And so there's very robust communities in Mexico that you know that have been really trying to take hold of their narrative and their story. And the fact that most people don't know the participation of their own countries in the slave trade and the whole global movement continues to have impact when people arrive in our borders and they try to integrate into other countries like the US. So I'm definitely very curious about the contemporary impact of these patterns. For example, we see our Haitian brothers and sisters and Dominicans not allowed to cross, and they are stuck for years. My work is in humanitarian work and immigration reform. And then we see new groups of folks coming from all over Africa in a new country from the Darien Gap, now stuck as well in cities, along the border, in a country that doesn't acknowledge their participation in the slave trade or understand it. And then they're faced with this, once they cross into the U.S., another gamut and level of hypervisibility as blacks that not necessarily part of the mainstream. So I'm really interested in maybe another conversation separately about that with you.
Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. Yeah.
But in mythology, in folklore, in oral tradition in Mexico, I made a documentary about the black presence in Mexico. There were all kind of traces. You know, you have there's a famous saying, you have a black grandma in the kitchen, right? Or in basically in the closet, meaning in the closet, in your family tree. So there was a funny kind of recollection and denial at the same time. And just one more thing about, again, this statement that's always made, slavery in Africa was different than slavery in America. The simple answer is yes, but as Shoyinka says, the simple answer is yes and no. You were still enslaved. And we talk about the mobility. Well, I've been myself at dinners in both Nigeria and Ghana when I, playing the interlocutor of very well-educated people. They said, tell me about the legacy of slavery in Ghana or in Nigeria. And basically it's, well, I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one. There is a very keen awareness of genealogies, of who your granddaddy was, right? Or your great-great-granddaddy. And many people in this room know what I'm saying is true. And that, so when we talk about how fluid it was, how mutable your status was, I think that's part of the mythology romanticization of the good old days of slavery on the African continent.
I agree. No, I have impression that that's a narrative that was born because the field of African history coincided with the anti-colonial movement in Africa. And I think that's part of the narrative that was born in the 1960s.
Right.
That idea that there was a benign slavery that was fluid and compared to that in the Western world. And I think I think that narrative tapped into that ideological post-colonial bigger picture when first Africanist historian like Walter Rodney, for example, start writing about Africa. And I think that's where
Rodney wrote about the African role in the slave
trade. Yes,
trade.
that's where things come from. I think that from that period.
Yeah, you still blame Europe too. Well, there's enough blame to go around.
Yeah, there is blame. Yeah,
there
absolutely.
is. And enough brilliance to go around. Give it up for Jorge Felipe-Gonzalez. Yeah.